So I think here is a bit knowledge gap that we could kind of try to mitigate. So thinking about cross-border mobility of people for the regions. Then questions rise like who are crossing, where and when are crossed, different incentives or investments or policies actually affect the way how people interact, and how social disruptions like COVID, for example, how it influences the way how people interact across country borders. More general, how mobility of people forming functional. Core question here. We need new data and methods, and yesterday we saw great results from Facebook data, which is also kind of new data, and I see Twitter complementary. And now thinking about more generally about the potential of social media data. A lot of studies already have shown that mobile devices can be spatial and social food. Also, a lot of literature across social sciences and beyond are showing that social media data can provide new insights to understand society, how different processes, what kind of social phenomena exist. More importantly, social media data is transnational, so it's limited to a country, of course. It is debatable, but overall inherently transnational. And that's why it's a sort of, let's say, cross-border action. Here, in my research, we have, let's say, divided our conceptual framework into two different ways. One is a global approach, more letting data to speak itself as analytics tend to be, but then other option is to use the individual approach, kind of make big data meaningful. What it means, so in case of my research, one option is to kind of delineate the study area, capture the data inside that, and then examine the data. Other individual approach is basically doing the same thing, but then taking another step by actually creating a study sample and then collecting individual data and study then that perspective. So when capturing mobilities from global approach, we can connect consecutive points or tweet Facebook posts. Then we can capture the cross-border mobilities from the border context. Whereas in individual approach, we can know the entire background of tweets or posts. We can capture the activity space of people. We can more or less capture their place of residence. And finally, we can understand better their mobilities while reasoning the context there, having more enriched data. And now I'm gonna show two case studies that we are working on. One from the Nordic countries and in the context of from last year, and then we have individual approach study ongoing in Luxembourg regarding cross-border mobility. Okay, and showing quickly some of the results. So about the Nordics global approach, so we use Twitter data as I mentioned, and we use our data tools also to collect data and process. So we studied a 4-year period, so before COVID, and then like the COVID year, like last year. So we collected roughly 30 million tweets from 400,000 users. Then we processed the data. So we focused only on intra-Nordic cross-border mobilities, and we got roughly 100,000 movements from 50,000 users. And here, well, we are using rather flexibly the kind of the definition of mobility. So you can see here it's less than 180 days. As you can imagine, Twitter data is sparse, so this is our approach, but keep that in mind when I'm showing the results. And then further on, so we analyze basically by comparing baseline, and then we do some linear regression estimation for the last year based on the baseline and compare the difference from the actual data we got. So first of all, we captured the division of intra-Nordic cross-border mobility flows. We haven't kind of compared it with other data sources yet, but at least the result is more or less makes sense. And then as a next step, we then saw or analyzed how these abilities between countries. So overall, we captured 70% of decrease of cross-border mobilities. And here in the matrix, actually, you can see that there is a lot of variation between country pairs. So in some country, between some countries, the decrease was more drastic than other countries, which is interesting. Then thinking about the temporal dynamics of cross-border mobilities. So thinking about the COVID year, last year, so we were able to capture the drop as in Facebook data or in mobile phone data. And then while comparing with the baseline months, we actually didn't saw the kind of recovery summer. So this is a bit different there. And we also kind of looked how weekly patterns have changed. So we saw some differences there, so that it isn't kind of a weekly rhythm concentrating Thursdays and Fridays, but it's more stable, flat. The moments was different. And when focusing on different country pairs, then we can clearly see that these weekly rhythms have changed quite significantly. Thinking about, for example, here, the country pair or the mobility between Sweden and Norway, we can see that during COVID time, concentration of mobilities were more concentrated on Fridays and Mondays, whereas other times it was more stable throughout and in case of Denmark and Finland, we saw basically opposite kind of weekly rhythm, which to capture these changes. And finally, about functional border regions. So we took some moments with the endpoints of moments, and we created, let's say, density maps, basically kind of delineating the functional, let's say, interacting border regions. Here, in these two maps, I'm showing the northern parts of Finland and Sweden, and then Denmark and southern Sweden. And more or less, we get the logical result from period. Then we clearly saw differences in the between the northern parts of Finland and Sweden, but for the Denmark and Sweden, didn't saw kind of change in the geographical extent of interaction. And looking for movement distances, we also saw significant drop in case of Sweden and Finland, but we don't see a drop in Denmark, between Denmark and Sweden. So in some cases there were structural changes, and in some cases we didn't find those. Only the overall decrease of mobilities. Okay. And then I'm gonna jump on the other case study from Luxembourg. Here we use again Twitter data, but a bit longer time period, 6 years. It's before COVID, so from 2013-18. And as I mentioned earlier, so we created a sample, which is 22 users who have been visited Luxembourg. We use their tweets as a data set. So we got 11 million tweets. Data for analysis, so we got 7 million movement, whereas 3 million movements were located within the greater region of Luxembourg. Basically, map on the top right. Okay. So the first question was, who are crossing borders of Luxembourg? Found that from our sample, 1/3 of people actually are living or residing in the greater region of Luxembourg, and rest of the our sample is non-locals, basically tourists. And if you focus on those who are living in the greater region of Luxembourg, we also took into account their, let's say, mobility patterns. And if we saw significant mobility patterns between different country pairs within the greater region of Luxembourg, we considered them as cross-border commuters. And based on our methodology, we found that basically every fourth is a commuter, and then the rest of them are considered as other local people, different countries in the greater region of Luxembourg. So when focusing on cross-border commuters, we mapped where actually their place of residence is distributed, and we got this kind of setting here on down right map. And then we correlated our data with the official statistics at the municipality level, and we got a pretty nice correlation. Well, I think we are kind of capturing the same results that are provided by the official data, which is nice. The next question was, what kind of cross-border mobilities we are able to kind of capture here? And here on the top right map, here are the movements that are crossing Luxembourg borders within the greater region of Luxembourg, or a bit beyond. And we saw that actually 40% of these movements are created by cross-border commuters. So basically, we can say that it's commuter-dominated mobility, and only, let's say, if in our sample 2/3 were non-locals, then actually these are producing only 15% of cross-border mobilities. And we can see here then that for other local people, of course, people who are residing in France are actually crossing borders much more Luxembourg. So we also looked at the distances that these mobilities have, and we saw the mean distance and median distance actually not overlaps, but coincides with the previous studies done at Leiser, for example. And when we are looking for different border sections like France, Belgium, and Germany, we can see that the closest commutes or movement distances are with the French side, and the longest one in Germany, crossing German borders. So more or less also matching with the survey data that have been done earlier, at least the trend. So then about mobility dynamics, what we can see from here, we are thinking different temporal perspectives. We can check, and we can clearly see that from our data that the proportion of cross-border commuters is increasing regarding the mobility that's crossing borders. And further on, we can then see monthly variations between different types of people who are crossing borders, and we can clearly see that the seasonal effect is more for leisure trips and not for commuting. So at least the kind of methodology that we are using here, we are getting also confident that we are capturing the correct people, or like actually the cross-border commuters. And thinking about weekly rhythms, we also see quite clearly differences between the patterns. So cross-border commuters, they tend to commute on the work days, and during weekends they don't commute that much at all. Whereas the opposite is for other people, local people who are more probably crossing borders for weekend leisure. So just now to wrap up these spatial and temporal results that we have got so far, and the question about the feasibility of monitor these kind of border interactions. So we can at least preliminary understanding is that this type of data has its strength. So it's inherently transnational. So we are able to quite easily capture cross-border interactions or mobilities in our case. And we can also capture, let's say, short-term rhythms and long-term trends, as I show in 2 different case studies here. And thinking about these different approaches, so really the strengths of this global approach is that it's timeliness. Actually, we could have done it like almost on real time when thinking about the COVID or the next crisis or whatever. So if the data collection and the processing and the monitoring is here and it doesn't require any heavy computing, so it's possible to kind of monitor that. Whereas with the individual approach, we can really contextualize the individual's activity spaces and the way they live, and also provide more information from the social setting. So having more contextualized and rich data. Of course, I want to stress here that this data is only complementing survey and registry data, so it's not replacing or anything. So kind of combining those would even provide better understanding for the region. Good. I think here we can say that Twitter can be used to capture cross-border mobility and also kind of interacting for the regions. We yet can't say that we are capturing the functional border regions, but at least regions that are interacting across borders at the individual level. And so, yeah, we could provide monitoring tools also for functional regions, hopefully in the future. But there's 2 things that I want to stress here. We have to acknowledge and tackle the inherent biases. Yesterday also this was raised in terms of Facebook data, but in case of Twitter data, this is even more important to kind of acknowledge it and tackle using different weightings and methodologies. And then the other aspect is to preserve the privacy of these Twitter users and also comply with the GDPR when doing the research. And yeah, how to go forward in my project, but in overall. One option is to kind of enrich the data further. So social media has also content, so we can use the use of languages, social networks, and we can get even better idea how interaction takes place across borders. And the combination of different data sources is something that we are looking as our next step. And furthermore, we can try to develop these kind of modeling tools to really monitor and give a better understanding kind of the dynamics of interactions, so that can be used in policy and practice. So I think this is all for me. I'm happy to answer to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for adjusting to the time and for your nice presentation. We are now going to give the floor first to those who are in the room and then to those who are attending online.
Presentation, Oli. But I'm sure that with this type of data we can better monitor of mobility. I'm an example of someone who is living in Luxembourg, not in the statistics of crossing the border. I'm crossing the border every day because my wife is living in Belgium. So clearly with this type of data you capture with the administrative. But what is really interesting also for decision makers is to know who is doing the border crossing every day, what are the characteristics we spoke about, the analysis, and the means that they use to cross the border. We invested a lot of money in public transport in Luxembourg. It seems that, and it's just an intuition we have, but it seems that people now are fearing taking the public transport. So we see that people are coming back to Luxembourg, but by car, which is not the purpose of the reform that we have implemented. So do you think that with this type of data you could capture both the characteristics of people and also the means that they use to travel after the shock, for example?
Yeah, thank you. Very good kind of reflections from your personal perspective, but also the question about, let's say, transport mode. And well, this is something we tried to do in collaboration with the colleagues from Luxembourg, Pisa. So, and at least at this point, I'm hopeful that from the content, we are able to kind of capture the transport mode to some extent. So you have to be positive that this is doable, but of course it's challenging. But thinking about content analysis of social media is developing rather fast. So clearly there are, if not now, then in the near future, there are models to kind of capture the model. Yeah, it even could. So we just, it's a matter of kind of developing and train the models. But of course, like, I think it's related what type of content or what are the topics that you discuss through Twitter. So can reflect something about your patient or your. Of course, we have to admit that there's a kind of bias in a way that who is using Twitter, of course. But if you are able to also weight, even based on the education, so provide more reliable insight.
Questions?
Yeah, thank you. A very interesting presentation. Thank you for it. I have a question regarding the first part you presented, which there is a huge decline in cross-border commuting, etc., in particular in these regions. And the thing is that cross-border commuting is different from normal commuting in the sense that you have a frontier. Okay? And if you only consider distance and local characteristics, you should expect more commuting than what you actually see because of the frontier. Okay, and the data you showed us, it's great, but I miss in this a comparison of the normal decline or just the overall decline, okay, in commuting in other regions in the country, in other areas, without any frontier. Okay, so if cross-border commuting, the story is about a frontier. Okay, and it will be nice just to see what happens with commuting, just with and without frontier. You know what I mean? Okay, so this I would have liked to see this, and just if there was a penalty, for instance, because of there are national restriction for mobility or something like that as a result of COVID. Okay, this was my first comment, and the second comment has to see with you presented this Twitter data in the Luxembourg region, etc. And it came to my mind the story from Hagerstrand, this cylinder of mobility and so on. Well, sometimes you see here, sometimes you see there. And I wonder if you can trace people all over the year, okay? And to see not just commuting, but just, let's say, stays. Now I stay in Barcelona, but now because the weather is nice, but in the summer it's too hot, maybe I go to the north. And if it's feasible also with tuning data, I think it's, of course, it's beyond commuting, but at some point it's also another type of location, which is not migration, but it's something in between. Okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for these comments. Two of them. If I answer the second one, then in case of Luxembourg case study that we have, so we have captured 22,000 users who have been visiting Luxembourg. So basically, we know their tweet history, like globally. So basically, we could study with our current data, for example, how people living in Luxembourg, or those who we have detected as cross-border commuters, we can actually could analyze how is their travel behavior like across the globe. So like, what is the kind of pattern there? Is it, I don't know, yearly frequencies and the random, etc. So this is doable, and it's nice that you pointed out Hegerstrand's space-time kind of idea, and this is something that we also have in our as a starting point, or idea that capturing space and time, over a longer time period, we are able to capture the, say, more habitual activity spaces, but then also more these infrequent tourist travels, for example. And then regarding the first question, I'm not sure if I now remember correctly, but yeah, it was in a way global approach, and we didn't implement any penalties, or we didn't consider the restrictions like per countries and how that has affected. But clearly, when I showed the matrix between country pairs, so I believe there is certainly kind of reason for that, why these spatial differences existed there. For example, yeah, it's not here visible, but in case of thinking about Finland, for example, they took very drastic measures in closing the country, and we saw the most significant decrease on mobility that was related to Finland, connected to Finland. But this is something that we could look at.
So if there is somebody from the online audience that would like to intervene, now it's time to do it. Okay, then I have a last comment, and we will give pass to the next presenter. But it's somehow related to the border effect that Vicente was mentioning. And I'm sure that the presenters in the next sessions are going to explain how this goes. And I'm not sure how you can introduce that dimension in your analysis. But what I think that is really relevant is to start to consider in time. I'm sure that Arnaud later on is going to expand on that. But I think that when you focus on distance, you forget a bit about the variability that these commuting times represents to commuters, no? Because at the end, if border controls are restricted, then of course you are stopped there. You don't know how much time it's going to take you. Or if you are using public transportation, but at the end there is a control in the station or in the airport, this is also going to affect. So I don't know if you have this kind of information from Twitter about just the time that the tweet is done in the morning, as similar approach that Frederic was explaining yesterday with Facebook. But at the same point, I'm a bit worried about privacy. You also mentioned that before, no? I think that we are not really aware about the kind of information that we are sharing for some free services that we are receiving in your mobile phones. So I'm not sure if internally between your team or even with your ethics committee in your university, you have discussed about this. You can give a brief answer, perfect, or otherwise we discuss it over the coffee break. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just a quick reflection on the last point. So privacy indeed is a very kind of crucial matter here when doing analysis or research, and we are in compliance with the policies of Twitter. So we are using actually the academic API, so which is aimed at doing research with Twitter data. And then secondly, we have taken care of how we collect and store the data, how we analyze the data, and of course, like most crucially, what kind of results we provide. So just to preserve the privacy and use the kind of the anonymity. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think my time is up. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we move to the next presenter. Angela, please. So Angela is going to present the paper, Does the implementation of the Schengen Agreement boost cross-border commuting? Evidence on switch.
Hear me? First of all, I'm very happy to be here in presence after all years of online conference. thanks again for the organizer of this nice conference. The paper analyzes the entrance of Switzerland in the Schengen. It's something which is particularly relevant as a mobility, especially after the keynote lecture yesterday, where we actually see that the restriction to can actually have a big effect on the diffusion of the COVID-19. And at the same time, one of the most important questions at the end of the lecture was, can we... let me give you some motivation. So the free movement of goods, services, and capital and people is one of the pillars of the European single market, and it represents maybe one of the greatest achievements of the and actually the freedom of movement between the member states has also been further supported the conclusion of the Schengen Agreement. Okay, so different from the free movement of persons in this case, the Schengen Agreement removed the internal borders between the second and countries and enabled the passport free. So it's actually reduced the time at the frontier, which is something related to the previous questions. So despite the benefit of Schengen being compelling, since the second half of the 2015, due to a massive pressure of refugees crisis and many other problems related with migrants, there was some temporary internal borders have been established, in some countries. One of them is, for example, between Italy and France, and also some other countries. And of course, currently, similar measures have been implemented to limit the spread of the COVID-19. The implementation of the Schengen Agreement is, of course, particularly relevant for cross-border commuters. The reason why is that the treaty made the cross-country inter-regional travel to work journey shorter and easier. Okay, so there's some different estimates found in previous studies that the introduction of these checks between the Denmark and Sweden, for example, increased the waiting time at the frontier by 10-60 minutes. And border controls, of course, cost to commuters as well as other travelers, but it's particularly relevant for border commuters, for workers, and these also imply a loss in terms of economic loss. I mean, I don't have to explain this audience why labor mobility is important. Of course, we can reduce regional disparity. We also see that most of the studies focus on migration, and we also see yesterday the Arabian communities important substitution. Of course, border might be an obstacle for workers' mobility for many reasons. And the most important obstacles between the countries are both institutional and cultural, and also, let's say, language barrier, especially in. So the literature on institutional barrier is growing in the last years, and in particular, we relate to two papers. The first one is the one of Dustman and co-author, 2016, which analyzed the impact of the opening the Germany's border to the Czech cross-border workers. And the most similar paper is the other of Berli and co-author in 2021, which analyzed the labor market effect of implementing the free movement of labor to cross-border commuters into Switzerland. Okay, so they analyzed the three phases. So there are three phases of implementation in Switzerland of this free movement of person. The first is a pre-phase before 1999. Then there is a first phase between the 1999 and the 2004, and then a second phase between the 2004 and the 2010. Okay, so in particular, in 2007, the free movement of person was released, at least for some countries on the European. What they find is that there is no significant effect of the treatment in the first 2 periods, while there is a strong positive effect on labor in the phase 2. So what we do differently, so we analyze the effect of Switzerland joining the Schengen area in December 2008 on cross-border commuting. So instead of considering the free movement of persons, we just want to analyze the effect of the Schengen agreement, so the removal of the border control. And these are, with a different identification strategies, we are able to capture the specific effect of the Schengen agreement. What we find is that there is a positive effect. So among individuals in the labor force, the probability of cross-border commuting is approximately 0.4 percentage points higher after the implementation of the Schengen. So why Switzerland? Of course, there are many reasons to consider Switzerland. First of all, it's located at the center of the Europe, and it's a destination of many commuters from European Union, in particular from France, Italy, and Germany. And the other fact is that the Schengen agreement in Switzerland was implemented after the freedom of movement was already granted to the EU15 and AFTA citizens. So this actually allows us, as I told you before, to disentangle the effect of the two policies. Most of the commuters comes, as I told you, from Italy and from France, Italy, and Germany. There are also someone who comes from Austria, but we are not able to include also the Austrian because of the problem of data. So there is only one region in Austria that share the border with other countries. So we cannot actually identify either in the treated or in the control group. By the way, in the French, Italians, and Germans represent more than 97% of the cross-border commuters. So we almost capture all the commuters. So the Schengen agreement, let me give you some details. So it was initially signed in 1985 among 5 countries. And currently it counts 26 members. 22 are European members, and there are also 4 non-European countries. And as I told you, Switzerland joined the Schengen area in December 2008. So we consider the event of entering the Schengen area actually in the 2009 because it was just December. So, and what it does in details, as I told you, it abolishes the border checks, the signatories' common barriers. It harmonizes the visa policies, and it allows vehicles to cross the border without stopping, and also it allows residents in the border area to cross the border away from the fixed checkpoints. So this means that for cross-border commuters, this means to save time in crossing the border every day or every week. And this actually working across the border would involve spending considerable extra time during the daily commute, as somebody already told. So which data we use? We use the European Labour Force Survey, which provides individual level data on measure on mobility. So we define commuting. So we can only observe individuals at national level. So we define commuting when the place of work and the place of residence are located in 2 different national regions. And then we also have individual characteristics, job characteristics. The only problem is that there is no panel structure. So what we use is a repeated cross-section over the years. So we complement this data set with many others data set to gather information on regional characteristics. And we follow also previous studies for the analysis of the lexical closeness of language. Okay, we use a diff approach. So we quantify the effect using this approach. So the most important thing is that we actually consider the treated group, all the individuals in the labor force. So that means employed and unemployed people who live in the region of Italy, France, and Germany, who share the border with Switzerland, okay? Or people living in Switzerland who share the border with European countries. So this actually means that we cannot consider the region inside Switzerland, we consider all the other. The control group instead is made up by the labor force, who live in regions sharing their border with another Schengen country, but not with Switzerland, okay? So all these regions are controlled. So we do not consider this Italian region because it also shares the border with Slovenia, which entered later in the Schengen agreement. So those are the trends. The absolute number of cross-border commuters in the sample, which is evidently growing up after the 2009. And on the right-hand side panel, there is as a percentage of the labor force. We estimate the following econometric models. So our dependent variable is a 0-1 dummy. Okay, it's 1 if you cross the border for works. So if you're NUTS 2 of residence is different from NUTS 2 of work. It's outside your country. So it's 1 for cross-border commuter. And we actually have the usual, let's say, post-Schengen treated and the interaction among them. Then we control for some individual characteristics, and we add a lot of fixed effect to, let's say, put away all the possibility, I mean, to allow for having regional fixed effect, year fixed effect, and sector fixed effect. So the post-Schengen, as I told you, is 0 for the period 2005-2008, and it's 1 for the period 2009-2015. Although it's a 0-1 dependent variable, we use the linear probability model in such a way we have directly, coefficient can be directly read. So that's the event study. So we set the 2009 as a reference year because, as I told you, entrance in the Schengen agreement of the Switzerland was December 2008. So what you can see is that there is no significant effect before the 2009. So the effect becomes positive and significantly different from 0 after the 2010, actually. But this actually allows us to have the idea that actually we are capturing the Schengen agreement and not the freedom of movement because there is no effect in 2007, which is the year that in which Switzerland entered in the freedom of movement with the European 15 EFTA countries. So it serves us as also a kind of placebo and allows us to tell that there is no presence of a heterogeneous trend between treatment and control region before the 2009. So the baseline model is this one. As you can see, it's actually comparable to what we have seen in the event studies. The only fact is that there is no significant effect if we consider the 2009 at the year of the event. If we move the year of the event in 2010, we actually found a positive and significant effect. And this actually is interpretable as a delayed effect. Because if you think about it, in our sample, there are a lot of people that actually are employed in their countries, and we also have unemployed people. So, I mean, to decide to start to be a cross-border commuter, you need time, especially if you are not already used to be a commuters. So we interpret this as a delayed effect because people have to reallocate in some way. So when we control for border closeness on language, we find the result to be still significant, as well as when we control for road network, which is something which is very usual in the commuting literature. Of course, we have a potential confounding effect, a huge potential confounding effect here, that is the 2008-2009 crisis. This, I mean, it's particularly relevant because it had a strong asymmetric impact across European regions and sectors. And of course, this might have boosted, and it was less severe in Switzerland. So this might have boosted the flow of cross-border commuters to Switzerland because of the relative better employment condition. So first of all, we have to say that actually, while the Schengen agreement may commute to and from Switzerland easier in both directions, the crisis should have shifted the commuting from one specific direction to the other, so towards Switzerland. So having in the sample also the Swiss labor force help us and rule out a bit the the fact that the crisis plays the major role. So by the way, we include several controls for bilateral labor demand condition, both at the origin and the destination, in order to control for these confounding effects. So from these, from model 5 to model 8, we check for these controls. So first of all, we consider unemployment, and in particular also young unemployment, because we know from the literature that the unemployment was very high during the crisis, and young unemployment was even worse. We then check in model 7 for different employment sectors. Finally, given that the crisis, the 2008 crisis started with a bubble in the house prices, we also control for house prices. So all of these variables have been made as a ratio between the level in the origin countries and the average level in the foreign destination. So that means that, for example, the higher the unemployment rate in my home country, in residence region with respect to abroad, the higher the probability to become a cross-border community. Okay. So we don't find any significant variable in this case, but actually we find that the treatment variable, so the coefficient of interest is always positive, ranging more or less between 0.4 percentage point and 0.5. Another potential confounding effect in this period is the exchange rate appreciation. So in particular, during this period, the Swiss franc appreciated relatively to the euro by almost 30% between the 2007 and 2011, and again in 2015. So of course, a large increase in the real wages over this period provide a clear incentive to go to work in Switzerland. So to rule out these other potential confounding effect, we also control for the exchange rate. So we construct a kind of real exchange rate. So as a ratio between the exchange rate between the regional residence and the potential destination, and the price level in the regional residence, because I mean, cross-border commuters come back in their residence region to spend money. So even in this case, we do not find any differences in the estimation. So then we restrict the sample to the interregional commuters. So first we have in the sample all the employed, and the unemployed people in the treated and control regions. In this case, we only restrict to interregional commuters. Okay, so either people that cross the border to commute or cross an internal regional border. In this case, we find that the treatment is actually, the event becomes significant even in 2009. And this actually is in line with what we found previously, because interregional commuters are really commuters. And we know that actually they have usually particular incentive or particular characteristics to be commuters. Also, they are usually longer commuters, especially in Italy. If you think to cross from one region to another, I mean, it's a long distance. So it's easier for them to change to become easily, let's say, cross-border commuters. So in this case, we find that for this group of people, the probability of cross-border commuting increased by 3.5 percentage point. Okay, we do the same checks as in the previous model, and we now find, for example, that the youth unemployment rate in the age 16-24 is significant. So we find that it's, nonetheless, we still find significant and positive the coefficient of interest. So to conclude, in this paper, we studied the effect of Switzerland implementing the Schengen Agreement in December 2008 on cross-border commuting, so on the probability to become a cross-border community. Of course, we expect cross-border commuting to be higher because of the easiness of going through the frontier without stop vehicles, so without checkpoints and whatever. We use the data from the European Labour Force Survey and other sources, and we use a different approach. And what we find is that the effect of Switzerland joining the Schengen area had a significant positive effect on cross-border commuting. Typically, we find that this probability is approximately 0.4 percentage point higher after Switzerland joined the Schengen area. And when we restrict the sample to the interregional commuters, the effect is higher and approximately equal to 4% percentage point. The results are robust to several specifications, robustness test, as we put down. And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the presentation and for also adjusting to the time. Now it's time for questions. Anybody from the audience wants to interview? Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Angela, for your presentation. I really found the subject interesting. It's really close to my research, so I really appreciate your paper. My main question is a curiosity question. Why you do not use the same reform that in Berlin and Gotthard, which is the agreement of free movement of people? Because in this agreement, the free movement of person is effective in the 1st June 2007, which is a little bit earlier than in December 2008. So this is my first question. And my second question, I don't know if you have it in your data. Do you have data at a more local level? Because you have data on region, but cross-border workers are higher in the number of cross-border workers are higher in a department close to the border than in department far away to the border, and maybe it can affect your result. But I don't know if you have a more local information in your data. So.
Now, of course, those are all good points. The problem are the data limitations. So first of all, to use the for comparability reason, we can start only in 2005, and but then we didn't want to catch the free movement since the beginning. So of course, I mean, our paper is complement the one of Berlin, say that probably when you have the Schengen Agreement together with the freedom of movement, those are two policies that allows to have more cross-border commuting at all. We do not analyze wage effect or something like that because we don't have data. And on the second question, we only know the region. So we don't know, I mean, for us, everybody's in the centroid, let's say. So unfortunately, we don't have idea if they have, I mean, close to the border or not.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
So one question about the group which is not treated. So the treated group is the group of regions or localities around Switzerland, close to the border.
Yes, share the border with Switzerland.
Yeah.
And cool. The Swiss, also the Swiss region sharing the border.
Cool. So you open the border with Switzerland. A lot of commuters are going to move now because it's less costly to go to Switzerland. And they come back and they spend in their municipality or region of origin.
Yeah.
So demand for goods and services increase in that part of the yeah? And you have fewer workers because workers are going to Switzerland.
Yeah.
So probably there is a call for additional workers coming from elsewhere. And so I was wondering whether the control group, which is the group of distance 2, if I understood clearly, compared to the border of Switzerland, should not be also considered as possibly treated. If there is a higher demand for labor in the neighboring regions, and there are fewer workers, of course, there is an incentive. If you think about the spatial equilibrium, there is an incentive for other workers to come there.
But you mean in the origin country? In France, so actually we checked for that. We didn't find so many differences. And so the second...
So you don't see a mobility within France between the...
Neither within France nor within Italy.
You check that?
Yeah, because we have the previous residents. So we checked and we didn't, I mean, there are, because of course you can also move to the border, to come across border, that's why But we didn't find this in the data, actually.
So you might fear that there would be a rising cost of goods and services in the treated regions because you have fewer workers and demand should increase, or people consume in Switzerland.
Say again, please.
So if you have fewer workers in the treated regions and people consume more there because they have a higher wage in Switzerland, so there will be a discrepancy between supply and demand. You might expect the price to increase, except if people consume mainly in Switzerland, the commuters, new commuters. But anyway.
I have to think about it.
I have also one question related to Frederick's point. And, in fact, I was going to ask two things. One is about impact on activity rates. And this is, in fact, related to your point, because it could be the case that what happens is that participation rates increase and there is no need for this second. Exactly. So this could be another issue that you perhaps could consider in your analysis. The other was related to these spatial spillovers that perhaps you could introduce easily in the model by just changing a bit the specification in terms of a diff effect, but controlling for the impact of neighboring regions. We can talk about that later if you prefer. And then my third question is, of course, in this case, the flow seems to be clearly addressed, no, from surrounding regions to Switzerland due to the huge wage differential between those regions. But from a theoretical perspective, it could be interesting to see who benefited more from opening the borders. I mean, there were also workers from Switzerland coming, so asymmetric flows or asymmetric impact, and also this difference between creation of flows and diversion of flows. No? So workers from France going to Switzerland, but perhaps commuters between France and Italy who also share a border with Switzerland that could stop moving from Italy to France and go from Italy to Switzerland. This could be also very interesting to see if your data allows. Thank you.
We only have the problem that there is no plan instruction. So you can know currently where you live, where you work, and you know where you live last year. That's it. So some of these things are not feasible.
No, I understand that you don't have longitudinal data.
Yeah.
Fully aware of that. But perhaps moving from this individual approach to the analysis of aggregated flows could help to expand the
flows.
from
Yeah,
that
sure.
perspective.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah, and now myself. One question: what happens with people who decide just to live out of Switzerland and then commute?
People?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Switzerland. It's very costly for me to cross the border every day, but it's very expensive.
Yeah.
So I prefer to live in Italy, which is it's cheaper.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not looking for a job. I already have a job. Okay, what I do is just, okay, I prefer just to live in a house, with a swimming pool or whatever, and then commute. So because you're telling a story of people just going to Switzerland because they want to find a job, etc., but maybe it's the other way around. People is living in the country. So I think it's part of the story. Maybe I missed it, and you mentioned that. I think it's also just to be considered. Okay, so well, you're decreasing costs, and then both type of flows can take place. I don't know if you can. You mentioned that you knew already where these people were living the year before or whatever. So maybe you can also consider different types of flows. So people going to work in Switzerland or people leaving the country because it's cheaper.
Yeah. I mean, I see all your points, and are all really.
Other work.
I mean, no. The fact is that they are very stable in time. Such flows. Okay, so people from Italy and France go to Switzerland. They prefer to stay in Italy and to cross the border. Some people start commuting again. I mean, but not so many. At least in the statistics, the official statistics of Switzerland, arrive as leave the country to go outside to live. So not Swiss people or no foreign people. That not so many. So part of the story, can be ruled out just looking at the official statistics of Switzerland. By the way, thanks for all the comments. Very constructive. I have to think about them.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, so I'm sorry because perhaps some of the comments that we already made now are going to be related to the next two presentations. So if the presenters want also to take for questions and comments and introducing the presentations, it would be nice. So the next paper is by Camille, and it's entitled "The Impact of Free Cross-Border Labor Mobility on the Labor Market for the Country of Origin: A Natural Experiment."
thank you everyone to be here. It's really a pleasure to present my paper at this. It's a working paper, so all your comments, your questions, or your remarks are welcome. My paper is entitled The Impact of Free Cross-Border Labour Mobility on the Labour Market for the Country of Origin, a Natural Experiment, and I think is a very good complement to the paper of Angela. So to begin, let me just introduce some key elements of this article. In 2016, Dussman and Gorlach note that many migrations are temporary, a fact that often been in the economic literatures on migration. The main reason why why temporary migration are in the empirical literatures is the difficulty to measure it. Very recently, the OECD defined temporary migrants in a free movement area such as the European Union and the EFTA countries as people who live in one country and work in other countries. This definition makes it possible to view cross-border labor mobility as an extreme form of temporary migration. The use of this definition has two major advantages. The first advantage is that data on cross-border labor mobility are much more easily measurable than data on temporary migration. The second advantage of this definition is that this phenomenon is very interesting in an economic point of view, as you know, a huge growth in the recent years. This graph, this figure, suggests a strong growth in cross-border labor mobility, and indeed, between 1999 and 2018, the number of cross-border workers has increased by about 130% in the European Union. And this growth is mainly due to the evolution of the European institutional context with the implementation of the Schengen Agreement or bilateral agreement facilitating the free movement of people. Cross-border labor mobility represents also a significant part of the local employment, as shown by this map. And if cross-border workers represent only 0.9% of the European Union workforce, this figure is much higher at a local level. When you approach the borders, the proportion of individuals who work abroad but live in France is really higher and can even exceed 50% in some municipalities, notably a municipality close to the Luxembourg or close to Switzerland. So these facts underline the importance of first cross-border labor mobility, but also the possible intensification of competition between countries. This intensification of competition can be explained by a strong wage difference. If we focus on France, which is the European country with the highest number of cross-border workers, and Switzerland, where they mainly go to work, we see that this difference is significant. According to Eurostat, who provide comparable wage both in terms of exchange rates and in the number of hours worked, people earn on average 2 times more in Switzerland than in France. And the difference is higher for high-skilled workers and for individuals who work in the services sectors. All these figures highlight the hiring competition faced by border departments. So after presenting some empirical evidence, now let's talk about the literatures. Recently, some papers explored the change in cross-border commuting policy that allow to first identify an extreme form of temporary migration, namely cross-border labor mobility, as defined by the OECD. And second, have a really important advantage in terms of identification strategy of causal effect, as it becomes possible to use natural quasi-experiments. Therefore, 2 main papers use this change in cross-border commuting policy. The first paper is a paper of Dussman and co-authors, who studied the effect of the opening of the German border to Czech cross-border workers in 1991 on both employment and wage of native in the short term. They found a strong negative effect on resident employment and a moderate negative effect on wages. The second paper, and this is at the heart of my research, is a paper of Berli and co-authors who studied the effect of the opening of the Swiss labor market to European cross-borders, both on wage and employment of native workers, but also on sales, productivity, innovation, and location decision of Swiss firms. They found a limited impact on the average wage of residents, but an increase in the share of foreign workers in regions close to the borders. Therefore, this increase in employment of foreign workers suggests a change in competition between Switzerland and other border countries. Although this paper studied a change in cross-border commuting policy, it focused only on the destination country. To our knowledge, no paper has studied the impact of a change in cross-border commuting policy it focused only on destination country, and no paper has studied a change in cross-border community in the origin country, while cross-border labor mobility can create an imbalance in the migrant country of origin because there is an increase in competition between countries to retain the labor force due to important wage difference. Therefore, my theoretical background is from the agglomeration economies. Indeed, agglomeration economies have shown several effects that can be applied to cross-border labor mobility. And notably, some impact on wages are expected through a price or a quantity adjustment. For the price adjustment, as people can earn more on the other side of the border, they have more bargaining power, which can put pressure on the cost for firms, for example, in France. For a quantity adjustment, this can be explained by the fact that local companies are subject to competition with firms of the other side of the border that generally offer high wages for equivalent positions. Therefore, this competition can create some difficulty in recruiting or retaining employees. And if firms want to retain or attract labor force, they have to propose higher wages. Therefore, the goal of this paper is to evaluate the effect of cross-border labor mobility on the labor market of the country of origin and notably the influence on wages. To do this, evaluating the impact of cross-border labor mobility faced a methodological challenge as we know that migration choices are endogenous. Therefore, to address concern over this endogeneity, I exploit a natural experiment. And this article uses the implementation of the agreement of the free movement of persons as part of the bilateral one in 1999 between Switzerland and the European countries. This agreement opened the Swiss labor market to European cross-border workers. The liberation process of the Swiss labor market occurs in two steps. First, a transition period in which geographical mobility were restricted to people who live at 10 kilometers or less to the border. This means that only people who live at 10 kilometers or less to the border can apply for a Swiss permit. The final step of the implementation starts in the 1st June 2007 with the abolition of this border area. So after the 1st June 2007, people can live where they want to apply for a Swiss labor permit. Therefore, I focus on the final step of implementation, as it has this date that the free movement of persons is fully effective and that the competition can be important between countries. To analyze the effect of the full implementation of the AFMP on wages, I use a French administrative database called Déclaration annuelle des données sociales over the 2002 and 2012 period. This database allows me to have some key information on my dependent variables, such as the individual hourly wages, but also location of firm at a really local level, and also firms and employee characteristics to have robust estimates of the reform effects. I focus on all French border departments at the border with Switzerland, so I focus on Ain, Belfort, Doubs, Jura, Haut-Rhin, and Haute-Savoie. So now let's look at the descriptive statistics by comparing the evolution of hourly wage by activity sectors in border department and non-border department. The most interesting fact is the sharp increase in hourly wage in the services sectors after the full implementation of the IFMP. This raised question of a larger effect of competition in these sectors, which is reinforced by the first table. We show a more wage differential for individuals who work in the services sectors. But to go further, let's look at the number of firms per sector, and we see on this figure that the number of firms in the services sectors decreased after the full implementation of the IFMP. The main question is this decrease is due to the IFMP or to the economic crisis, because it has the same date. I go into the literatures, and Fougère and Alt and co-authors point out that services in France are experiencing a relatively low failure rate after the 2007 economic crisis. Therefore, if the economic crisis is limited in these sectors, this decrease could be interpreted as an additional effect of the increase in competition between countries, as some firms did not survive to the competition. Potential effect of competition is also reinforced by a greater presence of high-skilled workers in the services sectors after the full implementation of the IFMP. And as Table 1 points out, it is for high-skilled workers that the wage differential is higher, strengthening the effect of competition. Therefore, descriptive statistics seem to indicate a more pronounced discontinuity for the services sector than for other sectors, and also a stronger competitive effect after the full implementation of the IFMP. I therefore choose to focus only on the services sector. To evaluate the average effect of the implementation of the IFMP on wages, I use a regression discontinuity in time, and to explore the impact of the IFMP, I propose a sensitivity analysis. In my database, data are only filed by years and not by months. Therefore, I choose to exclude the years 2007 to my sample to have only treated and untreated individuals and firms in my sample. Therefore, my treatment variables is defined as t equal to 1 if individual and firms are observed after 2007. So this is my treated groups. And t equal to 0 if years, firms and individuals are observed before 2007. And this is my control groups. A main question in this paper is why I choose a regression discontinuity in time and not a difference in difference strategy. The main reason why I choose to use a regression discontinuity is if I choose a difference in difference, I have some problem in the identification of my treated groups. If I use a difference in difference, I have to have my non-border department as a control groups and my border department as a treated groups. But in my treated groups, I have treated and untreated individuals as the full liberalization of the Swiss labor market occurred only in the 1st June 2007. Therefore, the identification of my treated groups is not perfect, so I prefer to use a regression discontinuity in time. To evaluate the average effect of the treatment on wages, the following linear regression model is used, with beta is the direct effect of the assignment variables T on the dependent variables. I have also a time effect and the non-linearity of time. And I also include some individual and firm characteristics. I include in individual characteristics the age of people, the gender, and the skill occupation. On firm characteristics, I include the firm size, and I also added some theoretical control and economic control. I added some GMI by department and a GDP evolution to control for the economic crisis. So now let's analyze the results. Over the medium term, my results show that the IFMP lead to increase the hourly wage in the service sector by 7.1%. And these results are in line with the literatures on agglomeration economy, which can be explained by both labor supplies and labor demand. On the demand side, the positive evolution is the result to the desire to attract or retain employees in response to the increase in cross-border labor mobility. In the labor supply, it impacts the labor supplies through a bargaining process. As there is significant wage difference between countries, it can be have some impact on the wage reservation for individuals, resulting in an upward wage negotiation and therefore in an increase in the labor cost for French companies. To explore the sensitivity of my result, a sensitivity analysis is implemented, and I start with the sensitivity to the time horizon. Whatever the time horizon, the results are significant, and we see that the effect of the IFMP increase over time. This is explained by the adjustment of the local labor market. In these firms are gradually increase their hourly wage to achieve a long-term equilibrium that will then offer a better protection against increased competition. The effect could also vary according to the workplace of individuals. We see that the impact of the IFMP is significant whatever the department of French people, but the effect is lower for Belfort, which can be explained by the fact that in this department the number of cross-border workers is lower than in other departments, so the competition is also lower. However, for Haute-Savoie, this is not explained by a low number of cross-border workers, because in Haute-Savoie it's a department with an important number of cross-border workers, but can be explained by the fact that in Haute-Savoie, early wages are higher than in other departments, so they have more important wages than in other departments, which can be explained that the impact of the IFMP is lower. I also propose a sensitivity analysis to skill occupation, as Berli and co-authors point out that cross-border labor mobility concerns mainly high-skilled workers, notably in Switzerland. Therefore, it seems to be essential to look at it has an impact on the country of origin. And we see that the effect of the IFMP have a significant impact on all skill occupation, but the effect is much higher for high-skilled workers, and the impact is much higher than the overall result, that's close to 7%. And this confirms that cross-border labor mobility between France and Switzerland concern mainly high-skilled workers. To finish my sensitivity analysis, I also propose a sensitivity to the firm size. And we see that the effect of the IFMP is also significant, whatever the firm size, but the impact is higher in micro companies and small and medium companies. This can be explained by the power of large companies that, as literature points out, that characteristic of large companies allow them to better respond to increased competition, and that they are generally offer higher wages than a micro company and small and medium company, which can be explained that we found a higher impact in these companies. To quickly conclude, thanks to this empirical work, we can quantify the effect of the IFMP on wages, and we find a positive effect on hourly wage in the services sectors. We also found short and medium-term effects and a sensitivity to the workplace, the skill occupation, and the firm size. This work suggests also 3 contributions. First, it shows a response of home country firms to free mobility. It also allows to take into account the international competition in the labor market and not only the national competition. And it allows to inform policymakers about the potential effect of free movement of persons in the local labor market in the country of origin. So thank you for your attention, and I'm
Thanks, Camille. Very nice presentation and clearly complementary to the previous ones. Comments from the audience?
No, I mean, maybe I didn't understand well. So it's a regression discontinuity where the forcing variable is
I'm
time.
not hearing you correctly.
It's a regression discontinuity where the forcing variable is time.
Sorry?
Your regression discontinuity,
Yes.
the forcing variable is time.
Yes. Yes, it's time at the 2007. Before 2007 and after 2007.
Okay. So, and you have these polynomials, so you have the square of time.
Yes.
And it's a bit strange as identification strategy, so sorry, I just tried to...
No problem.
And, okay, and the other actually variable that you consider, do they have some significant jump, some discontinuity too?
In my film individual characteristics?
Yeah, for example, you said about GDP or some other consideration of consideration.
I do not explain this, but in my paper, because in the regression discontinuity, I have to have a continuity of my explanation variables at the thresholds, and then do not have a discontinuity in 2007. So it's really stable in time.
Maybe I also didn't understand very well your strategy, but it for me was, I don't know, more clear if you consider, for instance, a diff in diff and you're a control group. I don't know, people, French workers far away from the border. You know, I think this is more and allows you also to control for pre-trends, because in your case, for me at least, was not very clear if you are taking into account, for instance, the effect that you found is not because of the wages are increasing in this region from some years to the reform. I think if you use a diff in diff, using, for instance, like in Dasman paper or papers, I don't know, workers from other regions of France that similar, I don't know, other kind of approach in order to find the good control group, it's better to.
Yes, the question on my methodology is really the main point of this article, so thank you for your remarks. I propose in my paper, I do not show here, but I propose in my paper modelization of the diff and diff with untreated people is the people in non-border department, and treated people is people in border department. And I also found significant effect, but the effect is lower. But for me, it's complicated to have a correct correct treated groups in the diff and diff. And this is why I prefer to choose, but if you have some idea, I take about it, because I don't know how precisely identify my treated groups with a difference in difference, and to not have my effect is lower than with a regression discontinuity, but can be explained by the fact that both in my treated groups, I have untreated and treated groups before 2000, because I observed individual before 2007. So I propose a diff and diff in my paper to prove the validity of my methodology in order that I also found a significant impact. But I not choose this methodology for this main reason. But if you have any idea, I take your advice.
Okay, I have a question. What is the predominant level of wage collective bargaining in this region? Do you have any idea?
The wage by department?
What I mean is, it's not the same. I mean, the reaction of wages to this policy change, or this natural experiment, you prefer to call it that way, depends also on how wages are negotiated between workers and firms. So if your system of bargaining is very centralized, then the idea is that it will take a lot of time to take into account this change, no?
Yes.
If your level of bargaining is very decentralized, or even you have a very high level of non-coverage, then you will expect that the reaction is much higher. So I don't know if you have this information, and perhaps you could differentiate regions depending on this level.
I don't know if I have this information, but it's what I try to do with a sensitivity to the time horizon, because I know it takes time to adjust to the difference in wages, and I know that we know that French are impossible to achieve the same wage as in Switzerland because the gap is too high. So the only possibility that I have is to check the sensitivity to the time origin, and maybe to expand my period data to because I start in 2012, but maybe I can put some data until now. I do not this when I write the paper, because I would like to have the same observation period before and after my treatment, but it's one way to see if the adjustment go in time. I don't know if I respond to your question.
More questions? No.
Just related to the previous paper, the same question. So you looked at the effect on hourly wages in the treated, let's say, regions, or the border regions, or the border municipalities in France. But do you have data also on the flow of people between the regions in France, and including the inflow of workers, of new workers from more remote municipalities in these border regions?
In the DADF, as a database that I use, the DADS, I do not have information on who is a cross-border workers, so I can identify cross-border workers, but and I have this information on other databases, but I think
of databases on the flow of people between municipalities, right?
Yes, there is, but not on the database that I use, and I don't know if I cannot identify the individual. I use it in my paper to show the evolution of cross-border workers, but I do not merge with because I don't have an identification people that I found in the DADS database, and for example, in the database that shows the flow between municipalities. I only have database data at the aggregate level. So I use for present the trends in cross-border workers, but I do not follow an individual people. But maybe it's interesting to add it in my database in the control variables.
I think it makes sense. We see around Luxembourg that a lot of people in Belgium who found a job in Luxembourg are coming to Arlon and these border cities, and the housing price, even in Belgium, is increasing drastically because of this. So that's what I was speaking about, spatial equilibrium effect before. You have the same problem.
Yes.
Which is interesting to study.
Yes, thank you very much. This is the same in France. In Haute-Savoie, we see a huge growth in real estate prices. So yeah, thank you for your remark.
So I'm sorry, but we need to move to the next paper. Thank you. Okay, so now is the time for Chiara. We present the paper, What Drives Cross-Border Commuting in Europe, an interregional parallel analysis of its special effects. And in case of very difficult questions, Nicola will also help.
Can you hear me well? Morning, everyone, once again, and thank you for inviting us to this really interesting workshop. This is a working paper that I'm co-authoring with some colleagues of Brescia and Nicola. So any comments and observations that will be very welcome. So today we're going to consider cross-border commuting around Europe under an interregional panel analysis on social effects. So the motivation to study commuting, I don't think we need one, but still it's nice to start with some numbers. So in 2018, we have seen that 14 million of EU workers started to commute to another region with respect to their residence. So it's something that relates really a lot of people around Europe. And also at aggregate level, we can see how commuting flows can contribute to the urban and the economic development of cities and regions. The influence, of course, are many, but the main ones are related to the implementation of the transportation and communication infrastructures, as well as policies related to the labor market performances, residential patterns, and also the environment. So the focus of the study is threefold. We would like to analyze the mobility drivers of interregional cross-border commuting, taking as reference the European regional level in order to see and also to include if there are spatial spillover and how they work over time. Of course, we are going to consider data before the pandemic, but still we think that this can support in the sense that finding the mobility drivers before the pandemic can still be used to the design of recovery measures. So we start with a bit of literature review. We have seen that commuting decisions mainly are driven by individual attributes, job characteristics, and also the surrounding spatial context. With respect to individual attributes, we have that gender plays a fundamental role in a sense that men do usually travel more than women. With respect to age, we found mixed evidence in the sense that elderly workers seems to be related to longer commutes because of their family obligation on the one hand, versus the fact that they might also have been relocated near their workplace during their careers. So that might also lower their commuting propensities. And that's something that we're going to see later on. With respect to the educational attainment, we have seen in literature how highly educated individuals do usually commute longer in order to find some, let's say, more fulfilling job conditions, and also because they can benefit from flexible working arrangements. With respect to job characteristics, we have found mixed evidence with respect to wage rates. So it seems on the one hand that lower paid workers do usually commute more because they cannot afford central housing. On the other hand, highly paid workers might commute longer because they choose to live in residential suburbs, let's say, and so they can commute longer. Full-time employment is also characteristics related to the working condition, which usually encourages longer commutes. And last, but definitely not least, temporary employment and in general the uncertainty related to the future of the employment can push workers to commute longer because they are more, let's say, entangled to their current residence, then they cannot change it. With respect to the spatial context, we have seen how the labor market disparities and in particular with respect to the unemployment rate and the salaries, so the wage rates are really important in determining mobility in general. And for example, with respect to the unemployment rate mismatch, we have seen how the lack in the job opportunities of your area, let's say, pushes you to find like some more satisfactory job opportunities elsewhere. And again, last but not least, the quality of infrastructure is also something that really is important when dealing with mobility, of course. And because, I mean, the higher will be the quality of the transportation infrastructure, for example, the lower will be the perceived time of your commute. The database, as we have seen previously, we also rely on the European Labour Force Survey. And this is a microdata survey which gives us information about the socio-demographic, the job characteristics, and the workplace mobility of people being interviewed. We will be able to capture cross-border mobility anytime the information about the NUTS code of the residence is different from the one of the workplace. And therefore, starting from individual level data, we're going to aggregate at the NUTS level 2 whenever possible. and include the analysis. So we're going to include the dynamics of cross-border from 2007 to 2017. Specifically, we're gonna consider the regional share of cross-border commuters by aggregating data at the individual level. So for a given time year in a given region I, we're gonna consider just employed individual. We're gonna assign to each one a dummy variable that gives us, returns us value 1 anytime the workplace is different from the residence, and then we're gonna aggregate data weighting the data, the individual data by the survey design weight. We can now have a quick look at some useful information before moving to the most empirical part. Here we have on the left-hand side, and I will start with this, our final sample. So we will cover 24 EU members plus Switzerland and Norway. As we had said before, we will, whenever possible, consider the NUTS to level aggregation, and this is something that it was not always possible, unfortunately, but still, even though we consider some nations, so some origins at NUTS 0, those are pretty small, so in this sense we can still proceed smoothly. We're going to end up with a total of 194 origins. Our main variable of interest over time is plotted here, and we can see how overall cross-border commuting is increasing. It's increasing all over Europe, and that means that this positive trend has also some erratic movement around 2009, which is the heart of the financial crack, but still we can proceed our analysis including the whole time period together, because we have tested for any break in the time series and there was no one. Another interesting overlook of commuting can be represented by these two maps. Here we have the regional distribution in the initial as well as in the final here. Again, as we have seen previously, we can see that the quantile values are overall increasing in time. So we have seen that all the values, with the exception of the maximum value, has increased in 2017 with respect to 2007. Interestingly, the maximum value, which is 0.45 actually, would mean that 45% of the employed individual of that particular year were commuting. And this very huge share was coming in both times from the region surrounding Brussels, so from Belgium and also around Luxembourg, which we have seen are areas of high intensity in terms of cross-border commuting, also because we should also consider that these areas share a common language and the total absence of important national barriers, which are, of course, also very much important when dealing with mobility. Another interesting fact that we can see from the maps is that regions surrounding the capital regions are really hotspots in terms of cross-border commuting. And this is a simple identification on how urbanization and economic development, which usually is the case for most of the capital region, at least at the national level, it's really important on mobility. So in the sense that the capital region itself is able to retain its proper labor force and attract at the same time external workers. So we have tested for spatial autocorrelation, and we found it as we were thinking of it. And in order to apply some empirical model to our data, we proceed with the Bayesian comparison approach. So we select among alternative models as well as weighting metrics in order to account for the spillover due to the spatial distances. And we end up with the best fitting model as the best fitting model, a spatial log of X. including in the weight matrix the 7 nearest neighbors. What does it mean? It means that our outcome value, so the share of cross-border commuters of region I, will be affected not just by the socio-demographic and economic regional characteristics of the region I, but also by the average of its neighbors. And in this case, we impose a cutoff of 7 nearest neighbors. So we are going to consider several and different variables aggregated as well as regional level. We have seen many so far, like the share of males, the distribution of the population by age group, and also by the education level. And with respect to the economic characteristics, we will consider the job characteristics that we have seen before, of course, again, aggregated at the regional level, and also the employment distribution by the economic sector and the disparities in terms of unemployment and wage. We will also consider regional fixed effect in order to catch for individual heterogeneity of our regions. And I think we can move now for the most interesting result. Here we have our model specification with, in column 1, just fixed effect, and in column 2, both regional and fixed effect, but still the two models are quite similar in terms of goodness. And what it's interesting to see, it's a first result with respect to age. So we match with the part of the literature that say that elderly workers do usually commute more, as they are our reference group with respect to younger workers. On the other hand, if we look at the two columns at the indirect effect, we see a positive coefficient, which means that somehow younger workers, or at least a characterization of the external labor composition of young workers, still attracts the domestic labor force. With respect to education, we found a positive direct effect of education, meaning that we match with literature saying that mostly educated individuals tend to go out in order to find better jobs. And on the other hand, if we look at the last two columns, for the spatial lags, we found let's say a reverse coefficient, meaning that the higher is the labor competition outside based on skills, the lower will be the tendency for my domestic workforce to go out somehow. We can move to the economic characteristics. We found again a significant result despite little magnitude for the unemployment rate differential. So the higher will be the unemployment rate of my region with respect to the surrounding ones, the higher will be the share of outbounds of commuters. And interestingly, we found a significant spatial spillover effect with respect to temporary contracts, meaning that the higher is the job uncertainty also in the surrounding context, the lower or the higher will be the discouragement of my domestic labor force to find a job somewhere else. With respect to the knowledge sector, we have the employment distribution by the economic activity of current employment, and we see how here we have a negative direct effect and a positive indirect effect, meaning that in the knowledge sector we have economic activities really much related to human capital intensive activities such as scientific occupation, and also on jobs related to the information technology sector. And we see here how this sector has the capacity to retain the external work, the domestic workers, and at the same time, it also attracts external labor force, as we see here in the coefficient. So the higher will be the employment distribution and somehow the economic specialization of my region in the knowledge sector, the lower will be the share of cross-border of my workers, and the higher will be the share of cross-border of the external workers, which is something that is really interesting from my point of view. And last but not least, we see how the road quality here determined by the intensity, let's say, of the highway system with respect to the surface of my region. We see here how both, let's say, the domestic transportation system as well as the external one really encourages cross-border commuting. So for sure, physical commuting and the transportation infrastructure that allows physical commuting are very much important for interregional connections. Concluding, we have seen how in the last decade, interregional commuting has witnessed a significant boost around Europe. And this is very important to understand work mobility drivers, of course, in terms of urban development, but also in terms of economic development, and also how the labor market are performing. In the particular case of the COVID-19 health crisis, of course, we should also consider today's, let's say, situation, and the health crisis is gonna likely have permanent consequences in the labor markets, especially in terms of unemployment and working conditions. So work mobility might be expected to change in the next future. With respect to this, it's important also to consider the mobility drivers that were significant before the pandemic in order to compare with future analysis. With respect to the COVID consideration, we might highlight three major findings, which I hope are going to open the discussion. The first one is related with education. So far we have seen how more educated people are more willing to travel to look for better job conditions. And that is something that is also related to the fact that they can commute with lower frequencies because they have high degrees of autonomy and independence in their jobs. And that it's something that was already happening before COVID-19. So we might expect that these individuals will further increase their willingness to commute for longer in the next future. But that might imply that in the upcoming future, there will be even a higher competition among territories in order to catch for more talented people and workers. With respect to the knowledge sector, we have seen how, again, IT and human capital intense industries are able to retain domestic workers and also attract the external ones. So there might be a spillover effect in investing in this kind of high value activities in terms of the overall regional economic growth, because you are able somehow to retain in general your workforce and also attract the external one. With respect to COVID, we might see a further dematerialization of the employment of this sector due to the digital transition and the presence of working from home policies. So that might imply that in the next future there will be a growing need of digital infrastructure for sure, but also a negative economic impact on the traditional commuters' services, such as hospitality or retailing, as well as transportation, and in particular the public transport. And lastly, the quality of transportation infrastructure, we have seen how being well connected in terms of transportation system, it's a really important mobility driver. And these results reflect the traditional somehow commuting behaviors based on physical commuting, but we might expect that within the next future, the COVID might have triggered a potential uprise of virtual commuting, at least for some selected occupation. Nonetheless, the future of physical mobility might change for this kind of occupation that might involve working from home policies permanently in their employment, but still for the others' job, it might be that physical commuting will still be a reality, such as the workers related to manual works, like I think about manufacturing, which is also one of the most important industry in a country, and also for those who are working involving face-to-face interactions, such as healthcare or personal care. And yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, so now it's time for the audience. This is the last presentation this morning, so please feel free to ask Chiara, but if you also have any comment related to the 4 presentations, this is also time for debate. Vicente.
Good morning. For the presentation, I have just a couple of curiosities on your data set. For each commuter, do you know the region of destination? So can you build like an origin metric?
That's exactly what we do. I mean, we start from the individual, the micro data, so the individual level, and you have the information of the NUTS code of both the residence as well as the workplace. The thing is that when you consider a European perspective, you get a lot of missing data. So you really have to handle what is the level of the NUTS aggregation that you want to get.
So basically you can build like an inflows and outflows.
Yeah, you can do that. And ideally, yes, you can do both flows.
Do you have also information on the mode of transport, like commuting by car or high-speed rail?
No, not that I remember. No, I don't think you have it.
Thank you.
Okay, so if I understood correctly, you use a distance-based matrix. So
Exactly.
The nearest neighbor, 7 nearest neighbors. But my question is, you think about any other kind of proximity, like constructing, because the road network seems to be very relevant. So maybe, and the other, for example, is the closeness of language or something like that. So it might be that we change a bit the story of the spatial effect in this case. And the other question is if you know how much important are fixed effects, how much they explain of the house square, for example, because they're usually very important. And if you can have a second step in which you analyze the fixed effect of the.
Okay, so with respect to the first question about the distance metrics, we have started by taking into consideration like the physical distance just to have a first investigation about the phenomenon. But for sure, like as you said, now that we know that infrastructure and transportation infrastructure particularly are very much important, that might be something that we can also consider as base of our weighting metrics. With respect to the second question, the role of dummies, of the fixed effect, okay. Well, I'm not the econometrician of the group, actually is Nicola, but still, I mean, oh. Go on, Nicola.
This is a tandem presentation. No, we didn't check. We have to do that. What I can say you is that the time fixed effect is basically not necessary. We check, we cross-check, we split sample, we made a short test for understanding if there was a break before and after the crisis, blah, blah, blah. We have to do that. It's a very good suggestion.
Yeah, definitely. And also, with respect to the time fixed effect, that is also interesting. Like we were doing other robustness check and still considering that you have the 2008 financial crack, still you can take the overall time frame together, which I think that's something really significant also to notice. And with respect to the language index, for sure that is something very much relevant, which we are not covering right now. So thanks for the suggestion.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. I'm just wondering how or whether you control the heterogeneity of your spatial units, like the nuts, because they vary in scale quite a lot. And that actually affects the way how much you are able to capture this kind of interregional mobility flows.
Sure. Well, with the fixed effect approach, you should be able, at least theoretically, to catch for the heterogeneity of a particular region. But if I understand what you're saying, the fact that you have very different like physical dimension of region, that it's also something that, of course, we are not taking in exact consideration right now, but should also implement it. Because as we have seen before, I mean, the fact that half of the employment in Belgium is cross-border commuting, of course, is because you have like smaller places and smaller spatial units with respect, for example, to Spain, which we see very huge regions. But the thing is that when you start to consider if you want to do a detailed research or something that is more at European level, you have really to balance out what you can choose as unit of observation. In theory, the NUTS level 2 should also consider the density population and many other factors that will give you some kind of homogeneity among your unit of observation, but still for sure is gonna explain something.
Yeah, myself. Yes, I have a question regarding just the data. The data you use, I guess, does not allow you to compute properly bilateral flows, or does it allow it to you? Is it possible, or not? It's not really reliable what you would get.
Well, we choose the outbounds because they were more detailed. So at least you have like the NUTS2 of your origin, and then the destination, it might be that you just have the NUTS1 or the NUTS0 for some years. So I think you get like more precise estimates if you start with the outflows. So if you consider your residence and where you go, because it's still you can catch the fact that you are moving somewhere else, at least at NUTS2 level. Whereas if you go the other way around, you might not be able to aggregate again data at NUTS2 level because you start like from destination at NUTS0 level, and you cannot really do regional estimates.
Yeah. Okay, then if you had, which is not the case, the bilateral flows, you could probably find better what's going on, for instance, going from Castile to Madrid,
sure.
Okay, because they have big flow and not just all the neighbors, surrounding neighbors, let's say 7, which is what you actually are averaging, okay? I wonder if you had in mind just checking not just the average, but a different measure of your neighbors. Because it's very likely that people from Castile, they don't care about very much, maybe they do, but just going to the south to Andalusia or to the north to Aragon, but they want to go to Madrid. Yes. And it's very likely that regions surrounding Paris are just something similar is taking place for them. So I wonder, I know that, yes, looking for the matrix, well, looking for the maximum, it's not as usual in the packages, maybe you have to program it yourself, but just as a potential improvement or just
sure.
add on your work, I think that it's a possibility because people is not just considering just the average region, it's just sure. considering Madrid or Paris or London or wherever.
Sure, that's true, absolutely. But again, we use a Bayesian approach in order to estimate the best weighting metrics, and we do it at regional level. So you somehow take the average number of influential neighbors for your region. So perhaps if you tailor more the sample, then you can get like more specific weighting metrics, where your very closest neighbors are the ones that are affecting you, because probably it's like that. I mean, if you are a region surrounding a capital city, you want to go to the capital city most of the time, reasonably.
Okay, thank you. So I think that it's time to conclude this session. I think that we have had a very interesting discussion of these 4 papers. I think that we could go on for more time on this discussion of whether administrative areas or functional areas or individual data is the most appropriate way of analyzing this kind of movement. But now it's time to have a break. So thank you to all the presenters and to all the participants. We will continue in half an hour. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
So Arnaud, Eduardo, as far as you are connected, if you want to check now the connection and that everything works.
Okay.